Hello again, 102. To conclude Chapter 24, the Second World War, we will go over the war in the Pacific and some of the factors that enabled the United States to win the war in the Pacific region. And for months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the news from the Pacific was all bad. As President Roosevelt confessed, the Japanese captured numerous territories in Asia, including the British colonies of Hong Kong, Burma, Malaysia, and Singapore, as well as the French colony of Indochina. Everywhere in the Pacific, said Winston Churchill, we were weak and naked. In the Philippines, U.S. forces and their Filipino allies, outmanned, outgunned, and malnourished, surrendered in early spring of 1942. And within 6 months, Japan had seized control of a vast new Pacific empire. Coral Sea and Midway will be two key naval battles in the spring of 1942, and at the Battle of the Coral Sea, this stopped a Japanese fleet headed toward the enormous island of New Guinea. Planes from the Lexington and Yorktown United States aircraft carriers sank one Japanese carrier, damaged another, and destroyed several small ships. American losses were greater, and the Yorktown was knocked out of the war, I believe, from this battle. The Japanese threat, though, against Australia was stopped at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Less than a month later, Admiral Yamamoto steered his main Japanese battle fleet towards Midway, the westernmost of Hawaii's inhabited islands, from which he hoped to strike at Pearl Harbor. This time, it was the Japanese who were surprised. As we mentioned previously, the Japanese had broken the military radio code, and this allowed Admiral Nimitz, who was the commander of the U.S. Central Pacific Fleet, to learn where Yamamoto's fleet was heading. Nimitz then reinforced the airbase at tiny Midway Island with planes and aircraft carriers. And the first Japanese attack against Midway on June 4, 1942, severely damaged the island's defenses, but at a cost of about a third of the Japanese planes. American bombers then struck back, and in the strategic Battle of Midway, U.S. warplanes sank 3 more Japanese aircraft carriers and crippled a 4th. It was the first major defeat for the Japanese Navy in 350 years, and it was the turning point of the Pacific War. The Japanese hopes for a short, decisive war were dashed. So what is MacArthur's Pacific strategy then? This is another major factor that will enable the U.S. to win the war in the Pacific. The idea basically is this idea of leapfrogging. The Japanese were skilled defensive fighters who rarely surrendered, and they controlled most of the islands in the Pacific. And their suicidal intensity in the battles of New Guinea and on Guadalcanal convinced MacArthur and American military planners to adopt a brilliant leapfrogging strategy whereby they focused on the most important islands and bypassed the others, leaving the isolated Japanese bases to wither on the vine, as Admiral Nimitz put it. And there were some key battles in the Central Pacific. On June 15, 1944, U.S. forces liberated Tinian, Guam, and Saipan, 3 Japanese-controlled islands in the Marianas Islands. Saipan was strategically important because it allowed the new American B-29 Superfortress bombers to strike Japan itself. General MacArthur's forces then invaded the Japanese-held Philippines on October the 20th. The Japanese, knowing that the loss of the Philippines would cut them off from essential raw materials, brought in warships from 3 directions to battle the U.S. fleet. And the 4 sea battles fought in the Philippine Sea from October 23rd through October 26, 1944, known collectively as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, was the largest naval engagement in history and the worst Japanese defeat of the war. By the end of the last day, 36 Japanese warships, including 4 more aircraft carriers, had been destroyed. And the Battle of Leyte Gulf included the first Japanese kamikaze, or divine wind attacks, where suicide pilots would deliberately crash their bomb-laden planes into American warships. They adopted this strategy because they were running out of planes and pilots. They would teach the pilots how to take off, but not how to land because they weren't coming back. And this is the iconic photo of MacArthur returning to the Philippines. He said he shall return, and he did. And again, the strategy for pushing the Japanese out of the Pacific Islands was leapfrogging. The closer the Allied forces got to Japan itself, the fiercer the resistance they encountered. And while the fighting continued in the Philippines, 30,000 U.S. Marines landed on the Japanese-held Iwo Jima Island, a speck of volcanic rock 760 miles from Tokyo that Americans needed as a base for fighter planes to escort bombers over Japan. It took nearly 6 weeks to secure the tiny island at a cost of 7,000 American lives. The fight for the Japanese island of Okinawa, which began on April 1, 1945, was even bloodier. Americans needed Okinawa as a staging area for the invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall. And the conquest of Okinawa was the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War, involving some 300,000 troops and almost 3 months of brutal fighting. More than 110,000 Japanese were killed, and the remaining 7,871 were either captured or surrendered. Now the preparations for the invasion of Japan are going forward. The Allied command launched massive bombing raids over Japan in the summer of '44. Then in early 1945, General Curtis LeMay, the head of the U.S. Bomber Command, ordered devastating firebomb raids upon Japanese cities. On March 9th, for example, some 300 B-29s incinerated 16 square miles of Tokyo, killing 85,000 people. These raids were so devastating because so much of Tokyo was made of wood and paper. And when these areas caught fire, it just spread like wild. And the atomic bomb will be used. First at Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Most of the city is destroyed. Little Boy was the name of this bomb. And you can see hardly this aerial photograph. Not many buildings are still standing. And on July the 25th, this order to drop the bomb was given if Japan did not surrender before August the 3rd, and they did not. And although an intense debate has emerged amongst historians and others about the decision to drop the bomb, Truman said that he had never had any doubt that it should be used. He explained that we faced an estimated 500,000 casualties in trying to take Japan by land. It was either that or the atomic bomb, and I didn't hesitate a minute, and I've never lost any sleep over it since. And then the second one was used on Nagasaki on August the 9th, 1945, and 5 days later, on August 14th, 1945, the Japanese emperor finally accepted the terms of surrender, and this is all formally completed by the beginning of September 1945 aboard the USS Missouri. Thus ended the costliest war in human history. The Soviet Union had suffered 20 million deaths, China 10 million, Germany 5.6 million, and Japan 2.3 million. The Second World War was more costly for the United States than any other foreign war, with 292,000 battle deaths and 114,000 non-combat deaths. But in proportion to its population, however, the United States suffered far fewer losses than did the other Allied nations or their enemies. So why did the Allies win? To recap once again, in the end, what turned the tide of war was the awesome productivity of American industry and the ability of the Soviet Union to absorb the massive German invasion and then push the Nazis all the way back to Berlin. And by the end of the war, Japan had run out of food and Germany had run out of fuel. By contrast, the United States was churning out more of everything at the war's end. As early as 1942, just a few weeks after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Fritz Todt, a Nazi engineer, told Hitler that the war against the United States was already lost because of America's ability to outproduce all the other warring nations combined. And a new age was born because of the Second World War. It was the end of colonial empires, and it saw the emergence of the Soviet Union as a global superpower. And Yalta's legacy, to recap again, in the post-war world, the United Nations, it was hoped, would help to keep the peace. And Roosevelt gave in to many of Stalin's demands because it was expected that we were going to need their help with the invasion of Japan, which the atomic bomb did not, it made this invasion not necessary. And the Soviets then will come to dominate Eastern Europe, which they view as a buffer zone to prevent another invasion of the motherland again. Since 1812, the Soviet Union has been invaded 3 different times, and they don't ever want that to happen again. They're going to have to go through Eastern Europe first to get to the Soviet Union. And this transformed American life. It had far-reaching social effects. As we mentioned, it ended the Great Depression, and it launched an era of unprecedented prosperity. Big businesses during the war grew into gigantic corporations as a result of those huge government contracts for military weapons and supplies. And these new technologies and products, they're listed, will eventually begin to transform the private sector as well, as did many new consumer products that resulted from war-related innovations. And there are now new opportunities, as we saw, for African Americans, women, Mexican Americans, and other minorities. And this set in motion major social changes that will culminate in the civil rights movement and the feminist movement in the 60s and 70s, as we'll see. And as mentioned, the United States is now a global superpower, along with the Soviet Union, and the 2 superpowers will shape the post-war world in what will culminate in the Cold War.